Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about depth versus depth of field and what it takes to really create a cinematic image. But before we begin, if you're new to the channel, if you're just joining us, be sure and hit the subscribe button below, press the bell for notifications as we post new videos. I got a lot of great stuff coming down the line, things I'm really excited to share with you about independent filmmaking and how you're going to be able to get your projects off the ground. So something I've touched on before in earlier videos is just how amazing modern consumer cameras are and what they've done for modern independent filmmaking. A lot of this started with the DSLR Revolution, which was when stills cameras were suddenly able to shoot video. And what this did was it allowed filmmakers to take cameras and attach very high-end cinema glass, high-end photograph glass onto consumer-grade camera bodies. Now, these higher-end manual control lenses combined with a larger sensor gave filmmakers the ability to do something that they were not able to do before with the cameras they were using at the time, and that was to enhance and control to a significantly larger degree the depth of field to their images. Now, if you already know the basic ins and outs of depth of field, feel free to skip ahead to this portion of the video. For the rest of us, let's take a moment to talk about this. What is depth of field so that we understand what it is we're going to be talking about here? In layman terms, depth of field relates to how much of your image remains in focus. Now, if you have a deep depth of field, it means that throughout the range of your space, more elements stay in focus, meaning that your foreground and your background elements are all sharp and easily visible. And when it's a very shallow depth of field, it means that the image has a lot of blurry foreground and a lot of blurry background, meaning you don't have a whole lot of space to move forward or backward. You're subject to move forward or backward before it starts to lose focus. It gives you sort of accents, your lights look a little bit more like kind of floating bubbles in the background, and just sort of softens your image and kind of drives your focus onto your subject. Now, there are three factors that dictate depth of field. First is your sensor size. The larger your sensor, the more depth of field you're going to be able to achieve. Second is going to be your f-stop, how fast your lens is, the aperture size. Now, the smaller the f-stop, the wider the aperture, the more light that can get in, and the shallower depth of field you can achieve. Now, third is going to be the length of the lens. Is this a wide angle, medium, or telephoto lens? And the wider the lens, the harder it's going to be to get a shallow depth of field. There's sort of a craze amongst filmmakers to try and seek out the shallower depth of field. The cameras, they want the bigger sensors, they want the faster lenses, they want to find ways to get as shallow of a depth of field as possible. Now, why is that? It's because a lot of people, when they see an image with a shallow depth of field, they assume that they have created a much more cinematic image. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. The cinematic image, it's sort of the thing that everyone in filmmaking is seeking out. When we're comparing our films, our independent budget films, we're comparing them to what Hollywood's doing, what larger budgets are doing. And in generally, there's sort of this phrase, looks like a real movie. And we're constantly trying to find ways to make our images look like that with the smaller budgets, with the less expensive gear that we're working with. So the problem with filmmakers relying too heavily on this shallow depth of field to achieve the cinematic look is that it doesn't always work for you. You find a lot of times if you're watching independent film trailers or features, all the close-ups look fantastic. All the coverage looks fantastic. As soon as they jump back into a wider shot and they're suddenly unable to achieve a shallow depth of field, regardless of their lens, regardless of their sensor, when they're in that wide shot, suddenly everything sort of flattens out. And you're suddenly left looking at something that says in your mind, this is a video image. This suddenly isn't cutting it. It can be very jarring. If you look at a lot of films that are quote unquote real movies or television shows that have been shot very cinematically, you'll actually notice that very rarely do they flush out their background. It's very rare that the depth of field is so shallow that you can't see what's going on. And generally what we're seeing in these situations, in these films, which we're identifying with as a cinematic image, has very little to do with depth of field and everything to do with something which is much more important and much more cinematic, and that is called depth. So what can we do? What tools do we have to build depth into these scenes so that every single shot in our movie, whether it's a wide shot, close-up, whatever, is consistent and contains depth throughout the duration of our project? The thing you want to think about when you're doing this, when you're building depth, is you're building layers. You're adding elements of separation. The first thing to think about is your lighting. Lighting is the biggest way to add depth to your image. This is by adding contrast, adding different colors, ways to sort of separate different elements within your frame from other elements within your frame. Now, a lot of people will find ways to kind of fake this lighting characteristics, the contrast ratios, in their post-production by crushing the blacks and by adding vignetting. But the best way and the way to make that most effective is to try and achieve as much as possible while you're shooting. This is why we are working with gaffers and electricians, and why your cinematographer is communicating with them on elements to add to the frame, different lighting elements to add character to our scene. Contrast ratios, shadow roll-off, color variation are all elements that are going to separate and add a layer of depth to our shot. Now, one tool that a lot of independent filmmakers will make use of is shooting a scene next to a window. This is something Christopher Nolan did a lot in his first film, and he's talked about it heavily. He did not have the resources to hire a lighting team. He didn't have a whole lot of lights. So to add a very cinematic look to his film, he made all this dialogue scenes take place next to a window. The way this works is that you have the outside daylight, which is very bright, and you're exposing for that, but your interior is going to be inherently much darker, which builds an instant contrast between your characters in the foreground and the background that you've established for them. So you're creating instant depth just by having this darker lighting. And like I said, it's very easy to achieve just by shooting next to a window. The next thing you're going to want to look at that's going to help you add depth to your shot are your locations. You want to find locations that have inherent depth to them. Now, a lot of times, locations that you think of in your mind are going to look fantastic because you love them, you think this has a lot of character, you've been there before. They're not going to photograph very well because what you see with your eye is not going to be what the camera sees. Very important for you when you have selected your locations, go do a location scout with your cinematographer and make sure that he knows what you're getting into and can advise you and tell you whether or not this location will photograph well and if this location is capable of adding depth to your shot. I learned this lesson on my first film. Initially, I wanted to shoot a scene in one of my favorite cafes in my hometown. When I went there with my cinematographer, he took one look and just said, this is not going to work. Absolutely, this is not going to work because there were no elements to add depth. It was sort of a box of a room. This is a reason why diners are actually such popular locations in a lot of films. If you think about this, how often do you actually eat at a diner? It's sort of a novelty dining experience, but they kind of appear quite often in film. And this is because they inherently add a lot of elements of depth by the nature of their location. You've got the windows there, bringing in outside light pretty heavily, contrasted with your interior light. The length of the booths, just the length of the room, gives you a direction to shoot down to kind of add and space out elements. You put your extras back there. You can have motion going on in the background. So a diner is a fantastic example of why a location will add a lot more depth to your shot versus just your standard restaurant, which risks you getting stuck in sort of a more box scenario. The next thing you're going to want to think about is staging your actors within the frame, placing them apart from each other on a table rather than side by side, finding ways to kind of create that depth and space naturally based on the blocking and staging of your characters. This will be most apparent and most helpful when you're shooting your coverage of them, particularly your medium shot coverage, sort of your cowboy style, and by cowboy I mean waist up type coverage. Now, there's going to be a lot of people that try and tell you some sort of theory that, you know, when you're shooting a coverage, you make it clean on the character or dirty, based on how you're trying to connect the two people having a conversation. Now, when I say a dirty frame, it means that, let's say the shot is of me, this is my coverage, I'm looking here at my other actor, and we've got them kind of here somewhat blocking the frame. Their shoulder is somewhat in the frame. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Now you can see this actor is blocking the frame a little bit and allowing the other actor whose coverage this is to sort of fill the rest of the frame. Now, a lot of people, like I said, will try and tell you this is like to build an emotional connection, to say that this conversation is combining them and building a bridge between them, and that's why they're both present in the shot. This is a little bit of nonsense. Really, this is being added and being done to sort of add depth to this otherwise potentially boring and flat frame. Now, when you go into an ultra close-up, when it's, you know, a shot more like this, where it's tight and we're very focused on the character, yes, it's going to be a clean frame because we're trying to put the focus on them. A close-up is used to draw focus, to evoke emotion, and let you connect better with what is about to be said. And in that case, you try and always keep that shot clean, but also the face is going to be filling the frame a lot more, so you don't necessarily need to dirty it up with the other actor. Now, there are cases where, yes, the connection of two characters appearing in each other's coverage is meant to convey a message. A very good example of this is Robin Williams' monologue in Good Will Hunting, where it starts single on him, and as it carries out for the 2 minutes of the frame, it slowly wraps around and ends with Matt Damon partially in the frame. And that is to sort of build a connection between the two, that what Robin Williams has just said has connected him and built a bridge between him and Will in the shot. But I would say most of the time that you see someone dirtying a frame in a piece of coverage, it is merely to add a layer of depth to the frame. Another thing I want to add, something that I see a lot in independent films, never, never, never shoot against a wall. Never put both your characters right against a wall, especially a white wall. Try and add as many elements between your character and the background as possible. Move them out into the center of the room. Just add elements to kind of create that space so that you can, even if your wall is going to be white, you need to be able to separate the light from them. You need to find a way to keep that space and add that depth. Another layer that we're adding, which is sort of very similar to what we just talked about, is framing. Now, I don't mean necessarily just building your frame and following your rule of thirds, but framing your shot, shooting through elements, shooting through doorways, shooting through windows to sort of box your characters in and just sort of add another element of foreground. A lot of times we think a lot about background. We don't always think about foreground. There's many famous shots in cinema where the foreground has been used to frame. Wong Kar-wai used it quite extensively in the Mood for Love, famous shot from The Searchers with Clint Eastwood, which has been mimicked, or not Clint Eastwood, excuse me. Oh, my uncle would be pissed. With John Wayne, as he's leaving the frame. Final shot of the movie, very famous shot, has been mimicked throughout cinema since then. So think of framing your actors with foreground elements and deep middle background elements for things that are in the deep, deep background as another way to sort of add a layer of depth to your shot. Another element to add a layer, which is now going to start working with the other departments on our film crew, is going to be production design. Now, production design is part of art department. It's the idea of set building, essentially filling your set with elements, with props. It's a very, very important aspect of filmmaking that is often overlooked, often due to budgetary reasons, but I want to assure you this is something you should not skimp on, because a well-dressed set with lighting, as I mentioned before, are sort of the two biggest factors to add depth, especially to a wide shot. Once you've got things to kind of bounce and shape that light around, and sort of things to just sort of draw your interest in the deep background and around the characters without being distracting, adds a huge layer to your film. Set design, I can't stress this enough, you should be dedicating a substantial amount of your budget to production design as it's available to you, because a well-dressed set will do miracles in making your shot more interesting and deeper. Now, along with that, and in sort of the same department, is wardrobe. Wardrobe is important for adding to our color palette, for things that are going to draw attention and speak about the character, but also add another layer of contrast. You know, if you've got a bright red shirt in a dark background, it's really going to stand out and really add an element. If you've got contrasting colors between your characters, walls, elements within the room, Wes Anderson is well known for taking huge advantage of this in his production design and his wardrobe department. Adding colors is going to do a lot to sort of continue building this depth into your shot. So this ties into wardrobe specifically, but can also tie into overall set design. Now, finally, depth of field, where we started. This is obviously another element to adding a layer into the depth of our shot, but it is more of a tool and something you need to be very careful with. As I mentioned before, a lot of times in movies, you're going to see they're not pulling a shallow depth of field too often, because they don't want to flood out the background. They don't want to flood out these other elements, the lighting, the aspects they've done to sort of build this frame. They're using depth of field to draw focus, to tell you this is what you should be looking at. There's a very famous shot in The Graduate where Dustin Hoffman, Anne Bancroft, and I can't remember the actress's name, when she finally realizes Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft are having an affair, the focus shift is extremely slow. She's in the middle, Bancroft is at the doorway. Right when Anne Bancroft appears, the daughter turns, looks back, focal shift onto Anne Bancroft, and then in the blurry foreground, we see her turn and look back at Dustin Hoffman, and they very, very slowly pull the focus back onto her. Now, this was used to sort of evoke the slow realization that she was experiencing as she was putting the puzzle pieces together and realizing the situation that was going on. Very effective use of pulling focus. One of the best samples I can think of using it as a storytelling device. Now, sometimes you don't want depth of field, and it can be very difficult to get away from. If you're on a longer lens because you want a compressed background to draw focus on our actors, but they're staged away from each other, and you don't want to be racking focus between the two, you'll see a lot of times, especially in older films, they'll use something called a diopter, which is sort of like a magnifying glass that they'll put halfway in the frame, and its edge is blurred so you can't quite see it, but it allows you in those longer shots to have both the foreground and background elements to stay in focus. You saw this in Hateful Eight. For me, that was the most recent example I can think of seeing it, where Tarantino did it. He had a long lens, but he needed both of his characters to be in focus, and he threw a diopter on it. He needed this lens, and it had the characteristics that would give you a very shallow depth of field, but he did not want that depth of field, so he did what he needed to do to get away from it. So yes, the camera is your tool. It is absolutely your tool, but don't be over-reliant on it. Don't think that you need to have a very specific camera with a big sensor and a very specific fast prime lens just to achieve a cinematic look in your film. This is why I really love the old Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera and why a lot of people panned it. It had a super 16mm size sensor, which is very, very small, about a 3 times crop factor for people that know what that is in relation to. But basically, that small of a sensor, people assumed you're not going to be able to get the shallow depth of field that you're desiring. But again, I want you to think about some of your favorite projects, some of your favorite films that were shot on 16mm film. The entire Walking Dead series is shot on super 16mm, and it's the same size as the sensor in these cameras, but they're still getting that cinematic look even though they're not able to completely throw out their backgrounds. They're adding these elements. So do not let the camera dictate your abilities and hold you back from creating something just because you don't have the sensor size that you're after. Take the tools, the best tools, the ones that you have access to, and make them work for you. Find ways to make these work for you. Depth of field is there. It's definitely a tool for you to make use of and help you on your budget achieve a much more cinematic look. But don't let it be a crutch. Let it be a tool to work with you that you have full control of, knowing that you can add that cinematic look other ways, by building your layers, by adding depth to your frame, and let this only be a smaller element, one of which that you have a lot of control over in telling your story and not relying on just creating this cinematic image. Now, most importantly, as you're going into pre-production on this, as you're getting ready to shoot your film, be thinking about your other departments. Be talking to your cinematographer who's communicating with your gaffers. Be talking to your art director, be talking to your wardrobe. If you can, take everybody along on your location scout so that your production designer knows what you're looking for, so that your cinematographer and gaffer know what the situation is, because you're all going to be needing to work together to achieve this desired effect. Look at movies that you admire, things that you were trying to achieve, and pay attention to what it is that's really giving you the effect that you're after. Is it the set design? Is it the lighting? Is it the color grading? What is it about the final image that is pleasing to you? And why is it that you want to try and emulate that? By all means, short films are a great way to implement some of this, to test some of this out as sort of a trial run. There's not a whole lot of risk involved. You can shoot one single scene and just find out for yourself how adding these different elements are really going to be a game changer for you once you're getting into your feature film, because that's the trickiest part. In a feature film, you need to achieve this consistently throughout the entire piece. You don't want to be jumping from your coverage that looks supremely cinematic to something that's a wide and suddenly looks flat. You want to try and find a way to have consistency throughout your movie, and that is only achieved by finding ways to add depth into every shot and every setup. So that's it, guys. Thanks so much. Each of these elements that we've discussed in this video, I will break down a little bit more in depth in future installations. But for now, if you've got any questions, throw me a comment. I'll get to those as they come in. I've added a few more resources for you in the description below. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I've got a lot more coming, a lot more great things I'm excited to talk to you about. And yeah, we'll see you next time.